It's really interesting when you think about the Declaration of Independence as being this document that establishes our independence, announces it to the world. There is a question of whether we're even going to survive, whether this experiment will last.
The American public, if you will, in those first, let's say 10, 15, 20 years after, not so much the Declaration, but after the Constitution is created, there's not a lot of big thought about the issues of slavery and race. Slavery is sort of a generally accepted condition of Africans, but very quickly slavery begins to die away in the North, and then it begins to spread in the South. And what happens in the early 1800s is you have native tribes that are being removed, you have new states being admitted to the Union like Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, and it opens up this vast swath of the country to immense possibilities to make money and allow slavery to grow.
And when you really start to trace it out, there's some argument that our religious beliefs become a first place where people are pushing for some notion of equality. But when it comes to slavery, it's not really something that's being discussed until the 1820s. There are concerns about imposing beliefs on somebody. We've seen that with the Anglican Church. Our founders were aware of that. There are questions of how institutions, how the idea of religion is going to be imposed possibly on individuals. I think that's one part of equality that stands out, is that it feels personal to people. When we really claim our equality, it's something that goes beyond a philosophy, it goes beyond the abstract, it feels like it belongs to us.
The question is often asked of the founders, particularly someone like Jefferson, really believe that all men, all people are created equal? And I think the answer is a resounding yes. Jefferson, of course, is making an argument about natural law versus common law. The natural law component is that there is a creator, and on some level, we all have the same rights of freedom and liberty. And of course, slavery is just antithetical to the idea of being free, of being born free, of being created equal.
We evolve our relationship to slavery. Our country evolves and has a changing attitude towards what is okay and what is not. I do think that when you look at that founding generation and their relationship to slavery, we use the phrase a necessary evil. It's something that exists and it's not easy to solve. And they do think that slavery will die a natural death. But that doesn't ultimately happen. We see actually with the end of the international slave trade, there becomes kind of a domestic slave trade, which actually increases the value of slavery. Slaves aren't the ones who are clamoring for equality. They haven't read the Declaration of Independence. They don't have this abstract notion that equality has been promised to them in this document. But equality begins to be discussed by people who want slavery to continue. And one of the things with this Southern thought is, if slavery is okay, if they like it, if they benefit from it, then what does that mean for equality? And one of the answers that arises is that all men are not created equal, that the founders were just incorrect on this.
This becomes a very, very contentious issue, because to defend slavery and defend the Declaration of Independence simultaneously is almost impossible. So there begins to emerge a new narrative. And the architect of that narrative is John C. Calhoun. Calhoun really just throws the Declaration of Independence aside and said that that term, all men are created equal, doesn't mean what it says. And this begins the 20 or 30 year slide toward civil war. 1820 in particular, with the Missouri Compromise, you start to see a defined separation. Now we begin to splinter away, and in the North there's a lot of apathy. Let's not forget that while the North may have been largely free states, there's certainly an anti-black animus. And Southern leaders actually begin to use that as a weapon. Leaders in the North are arguing that slavery is simply wrong and that this is at odds with the founding of the country. But for most Northerners, they just are able to ignore the issue because the North is so very, very white. And in the South, it becomes an enclave of its own. And what Calhoun does, and then later the Calhoun disciples, I think you could call them, like Jefferson Davis, is they begin to change Southern society. The South is able to create its own slaveocracy. As Gordon Wood, who's a very well-known Revolutionary War author, has contended, it's the Declaration of Independence that forces slavery to become an issue on the basis of race, because it hadn't been discussed early on. But as slavery grew, as the power base expanded, as it leaks into Congress, both in the House and the Senate, and then into the executive branch, into the White House, you have to justify it, because either all men are created equal means what it says, or it didn't.
There's a simplicity to the idea of all men are created equal. Period. Full stop. You see the Southern thinkers, those who want to defend slavery, all of a sudden have to start doing all of this parsing out of the language, all of these exceptions, all of these different ways to get around the phrase. It very simply and very plainly says, all men are created equal. There is a massive difference between that founding generation who is maybe uneasy with slavery, even while they're benefiting from it, even while they're doing all the horrors involved in slavery. Let's not forget that. They can own them, buy them, sell them, punish them. But that is far different from maybe a planter in Natchez, Mississippi, or a large plantation in South Carolina who is now relying on slavery and is no longer uneasy about the institution, who understands it as perfectly okay, as God ordained, not a necessary evil, but something that is the natural order of things. That is a far cry from the natural rights of man that Jefferson is talking about being guaranteed in the Declaration of Independence.
After the country has been created, Abraham Lincoln has begun to emerge. He hits the nail on the head. He writes to his old law partner Joshua Speed in 1855, and he said, "So we went from being a country where all men are created equal was accepted as a truth to now it's all men are created equal but Negroes. And if we continue down this road, it'll be all men are created equal but Negroes, Jews, Catholics, and foreigners." Lincoln had predicted the storm that was coming. Lincoln's writing that on the cusp of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Within 2 years, the Dred Scott decision takes all men are created equal, doesn't just throw it out the door, throws it out the door, stomps on it, lights it on fire, and said that black people have no rights. And that's the culmination of 25 years of work on the part of Southern leaders. For example, in Tennessee, you couldn't free your slaves after 1831. The only way, if you were an enslaved person, if you were freed, you had to leave the state. Well, that precludes slave owners, even if they want to do the right thing, from even going through the process. I think the biggest shift that happens in the South is that the generation born, let's say, after 1830, really the father and the son, 2 generations of Southerners have been raised, fed, and taught from the schoolroom to the home, sitting by the fireplace, sitting around the dinner table, to the pulpit on Sundays, that there is no equality. There's only equality among white men. The Declaration of Independence is virtually ignored. This is why Lincoln and the Republican Party become such a threat, because they begin to challenge what really 2 generations of Southerners believe. This isn't instinctively bad or wrong. It's not as if every Southerner was, running around as some, sort of evil monster. They had simply become a creation of their environment.
The idea that all men are created equal, the idea of equality is something that I think everybody now accepts in 2021. And we use it to make all kinds of inferences about the way we should be treated. And it's fascinating, there was a time there was a debate about whether equality was really part of our founding documents or not.
Had the country had a document that simply said all white men are created equal, we likely do not have a civil war. And God only knows how long the system of African slavery would have continued. But that simple line, that stand about the natural rights of man, is what led us down this path. Thomas Jefferson wrote the words, but his peers and contemporaries, by and large, embraced that position. The idea and the sentiment behind the Declaration was so radical and so revolutionary. The Americans of the 1770s opted to fight a war against the English crown. That's how much they believed in the idea that all men are created equal, because that comes first. The list of abuses comes second. It is Abraham Lincoln, and frankly, abolitionists and many Northerners who hold to that truth. They're willing to be the radicals and the revolutionaries of their time, to stand up to the promise that all men are created equal.